Hi, my name is Judy Siegel, and I'm here today with part 3 of a 3-part series. Today we're going to be looking at helping families raise resilient children. Part 1 of this series looked at how to deal with challenges from a family perspective, informed by neurobiology research. Part 2 looked at the factors that strengthen or weaken the parenting team. And this part now looks at your working with the parent or the parents in helping raise children who are going to be resilient. Well, what do we mean by resilience? Resilience is an interesting concept because you can't say that you've been resilient until you've actually faced a crisis or a very challenging situation. But resilience is the ability to bounce back or rebound from that situation. It's the capacity to withstand or recover from significant challenges that could ordinarily threaten stability or development. So when we look at the research on resilience, especially that which has been informed by neurobiology research, we know that there are certain factors that distinguish resilient children and adults. And we call them individual protective factors. So today I want to do 2 things. One is that I'd like to help you learn what those factors are so that we can help parents consider them in how they're raising their children. The other is that when we're working with parents, we're not only focusing on the child, even though we're talking about parenting, we're also looking at how we're working with the parents, because all of the things that become factors that are important to resilience for the children are actually important for the parents as well. Now, there are other factors that are protective factors in resilience, and I'm not going to be talking about them all today. So, for example, spirituality is a very important protective factor. But the ones that I am going to be focusing on today are the ones that are informed by neurobiology research. And so today we'll take a look at connection and the importance of connection. We'll be looking at self-efficacy. We're going to be talking about problem-solving skills and how we can encourage children to learn them. We'll be talking about health, and we're going to be looking at emotional regulation. Well, when we talk about relationships, we're really talking about the secure attachment that we learn from our parents very early in life. So much of the trauma research has talked about the importance of maternal warmth and a secure attachment. And so helping those of you who are working with new parents, particularly moms who might be having a postpartum depression, really understanding the importance of helping parents build a secure attachment to their infant. And that means both parents. If there's even a teenage dad who may be thinking about getting involved with his offspring but not really understanding or feeling confident or comfortable in what and how to do, helping all the techniques that can help parents connect with their children and build a secure attachment, that lasts a lifetime. A concept that I am a firm believer in is something known as family security. Family security is the belief that the people who you love and who love you are there for the long run. It's a sense of confidence in our ability to get through anything together. And it's a sense of bonding and deep emotional connection that is one of the most important strengths that we can offer to children. So in contrast, families that are very stressed out and conflict-ridden, particularly if there's any form of violence, whether it's emotional abuse or physical abuse, this detracts from family security. So children who are growing up in families where the parents are swearing at each other or where there's actual abuse, they're not getting the focus that they need at the times when they're most stressed out, and they never know whether or not their family is going to stay intact from one week to the next. And so being able to, when we're working with parents, talk about the nature of conflict, be able to really talk to them about what needs to happen to build this concept, family security. It's very, very important. Now, as children get older, we're talking about their ability to build relationships successfully, and parents still have an influence on this. There's ways that parents can help their children be exposed to and manage some of the ordinary socializing tensions, because learning to build friends of your own age is another factor that's important for resilience. And what I want to contrast that with is the concept of social rejection. Neurobiology research has identified triggers that they call universal. In other words, people from all societies and of all ages are impacted. And rejection is one of the most powerful, but particularly to school-age children, when being accepted by peers affects their identity and their self-image and their self-esteem. And so the concept that troubles me, particularly for children in the middle school ages, is one of bullying. And there's many forms of bullying. You know, right now there's cyberbullying, and that seems to be affecting little girls in particular. And of course there's physical bullying. And some parents don't really want to get involved in that. They kind of feel that since this is happening either at school or through relationships that are generated from school, that it should be the teachers or the guidance counselors who are managing this. And in fact, they're not doing a very good job. So parents need to be very aware of situations where their child might be either the bully or bullying. You know, it's interesting that some of the children who are bullied turn aggressive against other children and become bullied themselves. And bullying has a long-term effect on self-esteem. These are children that are much more likely to suffer depression and be involved with the court systems as they get older. So for parents, being able to help their child, either the one who's doing the bullying or the one who's being bullied, it becomes something that parents can manage, and it's very important that they do. Now, here's a concept that most parents would agree to, that helping their child learn to feel good about their own ability to do things. And isn't this a nice picture? So that we have a parent who's choosing at their time to involve the child in cooking. And that's what a wonderful way to help a child feel that they're learning how to do something, that they're enjoying, they're doing it with their parent. How lovely that is. But in reality, day-to-day parenting doesn't always look like this. And helping children develop efficacy means allowing them to decide when they need and want to take on a task. So the example of a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old choosing to dress him or herself as the parent is frantically trying to get out of the house in order to get the child to school. These are the moment-to-moment stressful situations where parents have to weigh, on the one hand, allowing their child to dress themselves in something that the parent would never have chosen, but that the child feels very proud about having, chosen these clothes that don't match. These are the parenting decisions where parents often stumble and decide, no, it's much easier for me to do this. But it's also a philosophy that carries over not just in things like, oh, my 5-year-old wants to dress him or herself, but it's about how children are solving problems. And there may be situations where parents, for example, a child who doesn't want to do their homework, and the parent realizes that the child's at risk of getting a low grade or even failing. To what extent are parents willing to let their child find their own way through a problem and solution and take the reward, or when they think that the outcome is going to not work out well, at what point did they step in? These are the kinds of parenting dilemmas that become very important for social workers to be able to intervene in. So we want children to have the chance to grow, to face challenges, and to find their solutions on their own, but yet we want to guard against children who will fail and lose efficacy. Parents who wish to take over are often reliving parts of their own childhood. Perhaps a situation that they're over-identifying, that something is happening to their child and they find themselves emotionally resonating with it. Perhaps it was something that they experienced when they were a child too, except now that they're an adult, they've got strengths, they know how to manage it. But even though it comes from a good place, in fact, they're really taking over from their child. This is a concept that I think is very helpful. It's helpful to parents, it's helpful to children, it's helpful to all of us, even as social workers. So when we think about solving problems or when we think about developing our own skills and strengths, the concept of incremental thinking allows us to understand that we don't always start out being as good as we'd like. Sometimes we don't manage things in a way that we think is adequate. But an incremental thinker understands that practice makes perfect, and that the first time we wouldn't expect to be as good as the second or the third or the 50th, and that what's important is perseverance, that learning from our efforts and being able to apply that learning and trying again is going to yield very good results. Incremental thinking versus entity thinking. An entity thinker is the one who sort of takes on a challenge, and then if they don't perform or have the outcome that they're looking for, they walk away. So for example, an entity thinker might decide, oh, I'm going to learn how to bowl. And for a child, that might be throwing, a couple of balls and watching them roll down the gutter, while other kids might be making spares or even a strike. And so a child after 2 or 3 balls could say, I'm no good at this. I suck. I'm not going to do this anymore. And I'll do something else. As opposed to believing that it will take me time to learn how to do this. And while some kids might have more talent in this area, I think that with a little bit of practice, I'm going to be good enough, and I might even be good enough to join a bowling league. So what we also want to think about is this way that children approach life in all or nothing. If you look at object relations and some of the psychological thinking, we call that splitting. And splitting is when we tend to think about things as being either all good or all bad. And while it's natural for children to sort of think about life that way, this idea of learning to see both, or thinking about the gray, the area in between, that very few things in life are either all good or all bad. And how are we able to help children recognize that splitting, which is very much entity thinking, is not going to help them become resilient, where the problems that they're going to have to face in life are going to be challenging and need perseverance and the ability to see one's growth in incremental steps. It's also important for us to realize that our children are learning to set their own standards and to deal with other neurobiological triggers. And just as I said that rejection is an important trigger, the idea of losing and criticism is another neurobiological trigger. So this can throw us into a dysregulated state if children fail to realize their own standards, and that can be standards that a parent sets or a coach sets. It can be standards that a teacher sets, and that we often see kids that seem to have it all, but in fact are suicidal. And if we really want to help parents understand, what's the difference between striving for excellence, which is something that parents may want to give their children, but what's the difference between that and the kind of critical self-talk that erodes efficacy, that takes a child into a dysregulated state? And so one of the ways of putting these ideas together is to think about how a child who would face a challenging event, who can see things in increments and has some sense of efficacy, can manage something very differently from the child who has a challenging event that they think right away, I can't do this, I'm no good at this, and they want to give up. They have a lack of control. They're filled with doubt and a lack of efficacy. They're filled with helplessness, and that leads them to despair. And let's contrast that with the child who is able to be an incremental thinker, who has a stronger core of efficacy, who's able to say, this is the piece I can take on, I can make a dent, I can come back at it, I can do it differently. That's what we want when we want to build resilient children. The ability to develop problem-solving skills is another factor in resilience. And, you know, children age, and as they develop a capacity for judgment and impulse control. But we parents can give them strategies and techniques to help them along that way. So one of the things that I'm showing you now is a decision tree that's actually going to be helpful for a very young child to imagine a choice and the consequences. And that it allows a child to sort of predict what's likely to happen if I take this road, what's likely to happen if I do something different, and make decisions that are informed and thoughtful. Well, another piece that's important for us to think about is health. And you can say, well, what does health have to do with parenting? Health is sometimes about genetics. And so there are children that have disadvantage, children who have childhood diabetes or asthma. And these are situations that are going to add a certain level of stress to the child and to the parents. But when we think about health, there's many dimensions that actually parents do influence. And one that I want to focus on, if you're working with parents, is the idea of managing a child's diet. You know, parents today are stressed, many are working, and you know, the idea of what we're going to pay attention to and really focus on, especially when there's conflict, that the child's giving us a hard time or challenging us. And so here we have the dilemma that many parents face on a daily basis. To have the child who doesn't want to eat the broccoli or their salad, how does a parent, and it's about the strategies that a parent has about their own ability to take this on any given day, versus the parent who's going to sort of walk away from that challenge, abdicate that, and allow their child to end up eating what they want and sometimes when they want. And what this is resulting in is an obesity epidemic in our society. So we get kids who are actually addicted to sugar and high salt foods and a lifestyle that doesn't promote health. And so when we work with parents, how they're dealing with these issues with their children is an area that I think we should pay attention to. Well, what the neurobiology research has shown about resilience points to emotional regulation as being one of the most important ingredients. And so I do want to spend some time with you helping imagine how is it that parents can coach their children. What are the techniques and the tools that they can use to coach their children in developing emotional regulation? Well, in order to do this, I think what we really want to think about is how are we going to help parents build emotional regulation? Because a child who's dysregulated is going to be a challenge to a parent, and if the parent is dysregulated, they're not going to be able to offer very much in that moment to the child. But a parent who's able to coach a child to develop emotional regulation is actually building neural networks in their brain, and that this is going to give them resilience on a day-to-day basis, and of course help them when they meet a situation that's overwhelming. So what do we mean by emotional regulation? Emotional regulation involves the ability to tolerate emotional states without going into an escalated state. It means having the skills to self-soothe so that a child is able to bring themselves into a thoughtful position where they're more able to identify the triggers, the problems, and have more thoughtful strategies about how to manage. One concept that I think is interesting is the idea of control. You know, when we think about a dysregulated child who's in the throes of an extreme emotional state, we're thinking that, you know, their emotions are too high, and there's some truth to that. But one concept that's equally important is the concept of control. So if a child is having a deep emotional experience but feels that they're in control of their emotions, they're able to get into a thoughtful state. In contrast to that, we have children who can feel that they're out of control, and it doesn't take very much to push them into an escalated or dysregulated state. Here's a thermometer that, you know, a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old could begin to relate to and to measure within any given moment whether or not they feel in control. When I say a dysregulated state, most people are going to think about the child who's exploding, a child who has a tantrum, a child who's going to throw things or start swearing and cursing and screaming. And that is definitely, that qualifies as a child who's in a dysregulated state. We can say that that's a child who's exploding. They're taking all of the tension and emotions that are inside of them and they're letting them out. They're releasing them on the world. But when we think about emotional dysregulation, I think we need to help parents understand that there's a powerful way of imploding that's as much a dysregulation as a state of exploding. Of course, it's not as likely to be noticed because it doesn't create as much of a problem to a parent or a teacher. But a child who's imploding has moved into a state of despair and helplessness. And in the same way that an exploder isn't doing anything that's thoughtful or helpful to deal with the trigger or the problem, a child who's imploding has come to the conclusion that the problem is overwhelming, that there's no help, and that they're in a state of helplessness and despair. They're not able to do anything constructive at the moment either. And so parents need to recognize that implosion is silent, but it's just as important as explosion. So what can parents learn to do? Well, some of the strategies that are very well researched right now have to do with strategies like breathing. Breathing has been found to be extremely helpful in helping a child get regulated again. So that often for a child it's something like taking an inhale for 4 seconds and then slowly letting it out, slowly exhaling, and that doing several of those breathing cycles can help if the child isn't ruminating. And so ruminating is when we think about the problem or the trigger, what caused us to get so upset. And when we're thinking about that in breathing, our amygdala, the part of the brain that's telling us we're in danger and releasing all of these corticosteroids, the amygdala continues to generate all these kind of responses that keep us in a state of dysregulation. So instead of thinking about the trigger or the problem, what we want the child to learn to do is to change the station and to breathe and think about something that could be something they're looking forward to, like what they're having for dessert that night, or thinking about something special they want to do on the weekend, or even for a child to be able to breathe and wiggle their toes or wiggle their fingers and come into the moment instead of ruminating about the problem. Children need help learning how to tolerate uncomfortable states. States affect our bodies. So, for example, even hunger. For a child to be hungry, this happens, what's the witching hour between 4 and 6 o'clock at night. But for a child to recognize that emotions are kind of like that too, that when they're feeling a difficult emotional experience, it can grab them, it can hijack them, and then they can become consumed by it. An alternative, and I have this slide to show you that another strategy for a child is to think about an emotion as something that is real at the moment, just like a cloud might be blocking the sun. And when the cloud goes over the sun, the room seems dark. But if they just breathe and stay with that for a few breathing cycles, what they can find is that the sun returns, and that something that felt unbearable to us, 20 seconds ago, is something that actually we move beyond. So helping a child learn to tolerate an uncomfortable state is part of becoming emotionally regulated. These techniques are actually part of what we call mindfulness. And mindfulness is very popular right now. There's studies that are actually done in trauma centers and in psychiatric inpatient settings and outpatient settings. So these are strategies that are working with children who are in clinic situations, but mindfulness strategies are things that parents can begin to think about for their well children, for all children. And these are strategies that actually are very good for the parents as well, being able to stay in the moment and to breathe and to develop ways of allowing their self-awareness to bring them back into a state of emotional regulation. Another strategy that parents can help their children learn is to recognize that emotions really translate into feelings. And so from a very young age, from the age of 3 and 4, children can be helped to identify when they feel sad or when they feel mad, when they feel happy. And as they get older, they're able to develop feelings that are more complicated, so they're able to generate perhaps 50 different feeling states. They're able to understand that they can develop more than one emotional experience or feeling at the same time. So they might feel angry but worried at the same time. Children who are able to do this are building neural networks that are going to help them when they're facing that crisis. So being able to help your child name feelings is a very important strategy. Well, like I said before, these are good ideas, and parents will benefit from learning them from you. But parents also need to be emotionally regulated in order to do that with their children, in order to coach them properly. And so when we work with parents, we want to develop an alliance that, yes, the focus can be partially on the child and helping the parents think about different dilemmas they're facing. We can provide them with psychoeducation. We can provide them with some of this information. But what we really want to do is build efficacy in the parents and emotional regulation in the parents, so that they're feeling more confident about their ability to parent, and that they're feeling that the climate they've created, that all family members live in, is one that has family security and has much more attachment and goodwill, so that all family members are actually strengthened. And so the work that we can provide for parents is not only creating children who will become resilient, but it's also to create families that are going to survive these very challenging times. Thank you.